This year marked the 10th anniversary of DEADBOLT, a wonderfully clever stealth shooter made by Hopoo Games, who are best known for creating Risk of Rain and Risk of Rain, as well as Risk of Rain. Thematically, DEADBOLT marks a clear departure from Hopoo's customary subject of weather forecasting, and instead it finds its style in grimy and a little heavy-handed noir of urban crime, together with the tactical shootouts of John Wick, although the game adds something entirely novel to the John Wick formula: a plot. In all seriousness though, DEADBOLT's great. I wouldn't say it's my go-to example of the medium's artistic potential, but damn is it smart. There is so much passion and competence at display here that I find myself a little miffed it doesn't enjoy the spotlight of more mainstream indie darlings. For one, the game has incredibly rich mechanics, which is surely a core reason why fans are building custom levels to this day. I should also highlight the minimalistic writing that hides a subtle and unexpectedly moving narrative. And perhaps most importantly, I have to mention the soundtrack. I firmly believe that Chris Christodoulou is the most overqualified person in the games industry, and it brings me endless frustration that DEADBOLT's OST hasn't been recognized more widely. For this video, however, I want to take a quick look at its level design, which I believe is a bit of an underappreciated craft. There are too many examples of games with very passive level design, at best featuring interesting environment design or visual spectacle, but never really engaging the player with the spatial logic itself. DEADBOLT demonstrates what you can achieve with well-designed levels. There is a particular immediacy of space. Its underlying structure is a driving force of gameplay to a degree that makes many other games seem bland in comparison. We'll explore this topic from three directions, those being the structural, informative, and aesthetic functions of level design. Even though we'll avoid story-related spoilers, I will be showing most of the game's levels. If you haven't played through them yourself, it might ruin some of the magic, so gameplay-related spoilers ahead. I'll start with a somewhat controversial statement that might annoy real level designers, but which I firmly hold to be true. The foundation of creating interesting levels is not actually the level design, rather it's the mechanics design. The best level design is almost always found in games with spatially oriented mechanics. This is at once incredibly important and kind of obvious. If you don't let your players meaningfully interact with the game space, they're not going to have meaningful interactions with the game space. Take for example Katana Zero. It's a game with somewhat inoffensive combat mechanics, and if you place your character in a room with some baddies, you'll probably end up with a reasonably fun encounter. Now ask yourself, what changes if we expand this space beyond a single encounter? Not much, I would argue. Sometimes you might alert enemies from other rooms, but loosely speaking, all that matters from a gameplay perspective is the series of dudes in front of you. In open-ended levels, you might play around with different sequences or multiple paths to the same room, and that's nice, but ultimately the spatial logic plays a minimal role compared to the combat. My claim here is not that Katana Zero has bad level design, rather I'm saying that Katana Zero has unremarkable level design, and this was inevitable because you don't really interact with the layout. The level design can't be anything more than a layer of set dressing on top of a semi-linear sequence of encounters. For returning viewers of the channel, there is no design space for interesting level design. I picked Katana Zero as the example here because its side-scroller building layouts are somewhat similar to DEADBOLT, but I don't mean to single it out. This is something that most games struggle with. And I do mean most games. Just to take a widely different example, I recently played Cyberpunk 2077 and found myself disappointed with its cityscape. I distinctly remember the short-lived excitement of unlocking double jumps and noticing all these balconies and AC units you could use to climb to the rooftops, only to find nothing there because your primary way of mechanically interacting with the city is picking up crafting components. Cyberpunk has incredible effort spent on environment design, and it falls flat anyway because you can't really do anything with it. This is the industry's current level design paradigm, densely decorated emptiness. I believe this attitude is emblematic of a broader trend. Cyberpunk's Night City, as with maybe any other AAA game setting, operates by a cinematic logic rather than a ludic logic, the result being a visually rich space but an impoverished game space. The structural role of level design, which is arguably its most fundamental function, gets easily sidelined. And again, I believe the root cause is a mechanics design that fails to bolster spatial interactivity. With this context in mind, how does DEADBOLT compare? The very basics of movement and shooting are of little interest to us and hopefully intuitively grasped from the footage you're seeing, so instead we'll turn our attention to 3 other gameplay systems. First off, our protagonist Reaper can turn into smoke in order to travel through vents. Understood at the most basic level, this means you have more strategic options to navigate a level, but there's some more nuance to this. Since enemies can't use the vent system, natural applications include escape from combat encounters or luring enemies to specific spots. Decision-making here tends towards the planned rather than the improvisational. The slow entry and exit animations make the Reaper vulnerable while using the vent system, so escape routes ideally have to be planned in advance. Second in our list of mechanics is lights. We can apply the usual stealth game logic. Darkness means you're hidden, light means you're vulnerable. Though DEADBOLT's rendition of lighting is particularly clear and interactive. Reaper can turn off all the lights in a room, but this requires him to reach a light switch, and an enemy can always turn them back on. Alternatively, he can shoot out the lights, which is more permanent and can be done from anywhere in the room, but this can be risky as it wastes ammo and creates noise. So there is an added interactivity in how the player can make a hostile space more manageable. And the last of our central gameplay systems is sound. Shooting guns or getting spotted attracts the attention of this game's admittedly janky enemy AI. Again, this is not unique for stealth games, but it is distinctively spatial in its effects. Misplaced noise can have you scrambling for the nearest vent as the whole level converges upon you, whereas well-timed sounds can lure unsuspecting enemies to the dark, where they become vulnerable. These 3 systems already create a host of vibrant dynamics, though it's far from an exhaustive list of DEADBOLT's mechanics. Some of them are a little gimmicky or inelegant, like the almost irrelevant fuse boxes, but for the most part, DEADBOLT is a very mechanically tight game. Hobo Games noticeably spent effort dreaming up mechanics that could facilitate richly interactive levels. And this is not something to appreciate only from the abstract standpoint of game design theory. We can see how it translates into tangible player experience. In Katana Zero, I only ever do whatever makes sense at the moment, whereas in DEADBOLT I'm planning ahead. The game demands that I pay close attention to each level's layout. Consider the fairly standard level looks in Tenebris. So you've reached this room. Now what? You could run upstairs guns blazing, though this might provoke half the level. You may also take out the light and slowly lure enemies to this dark room for easy picking. Perhaps you could vent over to the other side of the level, luring all enemies there, and then escaping back so this half of the horde becomes more manageable. Or maybe you should abandon this room entirely and try a different direction. There is a diversity of tactical options, each of which requires that I take note of the lights, the entry and exit points, the nearby enemies, any relevant ammo pickups, and more. And I suppose this illustrates why I can't fully analyze any level in this video. The combinatorial explosion of player choices renders in-depth analysis impractical. And this is not even a particularly remarkable room. Indeed, most levels are built something like this, though we also have a few notable exceptions where the structure is completely novel. So, how can you make an interesting level focusing on bartenders who don't really die unless you destroy their phylacteries? There is this very tense level called Bottle Service, where all the phylacteries are in one room that's really tough to reach. Here the level is structured all around getting to the center, and before that point you can't really do anything about the immortal horde blocking your way. It ends up being this hectic and violent scramble as you try to push through, followed by a gratifying table turn as the bartenders become almost powerless without their phylacteries. Elsewhere, in forced conversion, you need to plan the most efficient route, because you only have 60 seconds to reach some key points scattered throughout. Here again, in a structural sense, the way in which you approach the level is completely upended. Do you see the pattern? I'll put it this way. Most other games have you playing in the level. DEADBOLT has you playing the level. The structure becomes the problem and the solution. This is one among very few action games where the level structures are deeply present in your experience, though this is by no means the only merit of DEADBOLT's level design. If you've ever been recommended level design content online, you have probably seen these eye-catching analyses of lighting and guiding lines. You would be forgiven for finding them a bit silly. It can be tempting to exaggerate the importance of this approach, though it does relate to one of level design's main goals, that of communicating information to the player. This comes in two flavors, the first being this oh-so-familiar process of conveying navigation-related information, like how contrast and composition gently nudge a player towards their goals. This, however, is not that pertinent to 2D level design, especially a game like DEADBOLT where understanding the layout is next to trivial. What we should really focus on is the second half of informative level design, which concerns teaching the mechanics. As you well know, traditional text-based teaching is annoying, condescending, ineffective, and skipped by half the audience. But fortunately for us designers, most of the basics can be conveyed by various clever level design tricks. DEADBOLT is full of such crafty solutions. Most of the levels revolve around some new enemy type or other mechanic, and every time the designers have added a subtle micro-tutorial for the player. Perhaps the most widely known method of doing this is called a skill gate, where a player's progress is blocked until they demonstrate basic understanding of a mechanic. Have you noticed how whenever you unlock double jumping in Metroidvanias, it tends to happen in a room that you can only leave by double jumping? That's a skill gate. The mechanic has been isolated in an environment suited for learning, where even a confused player could stumble into understanding it and there is no room for misinterpretation. Consider the level structurally sound. Here the mechanic in question is landmines, as well as enemies that place these mines. The very first room acts as a skill gate. You can't get past this room until you realize that mines can be shot. Rather brilliantly though, the room also contains a patrolling sergeant, so most players will also learn that enemies don't trigger mines and that shooting mines can be used tactically. Also, the room has just the perfect width. Many players will also learn to keep their distance when shooting mines. One other commonly used method of indirect teaching is the demonstrative method. This entails showing some process from a distance, letting the players learn new information by observation. So, for example, there's this enemy type called generals, who can revive other enemies' corpses. Here's a riddle. How would you introduce them to the player? It seems impossible to ensure that the player will first kill some enemies and then see a general reviving them. No matter what layout we use, the player will just interrupt and kill the general without witnessing their behavior. DEADBOLT solves this problem in bar hopping, where you start by killing all enemies in a bar, then you go clear a second location, and finally return to the level's first half. Upon returning, you simply don't have enough time to stop the generals who are already reviving the enemies you killed previously. What a clever solution! Sometimes the use of these methods isn't clear-cut, but the basic idea is always the same. Start with a separate, straightforward encounter that emphasizes the new mechanic. Once the player understands the mechanic, they may proceed. For example, night crawlers are the only enemy that can see in the dark. Surely enough, the level introducing Nightcrawlers places its first light source away from the entrance, so that you enter from the dark, but the Nightcrawler sees you anyway and the mechanic is learned. Remember bartenders who respawn unless you destroy their phylacteries? The level Bloody Mary starts with a tutorial room that lets you shoot the bartender and his phylactery right away. Only after dealing with this simple scenario do you get to explore the rest of the level, where phylacteries are placed less trivially. Some of these are just lovely to look at. Follow the Hounds is a level that introduces Hellhound enemies which are very fast but incapable of opening doors. This could be easily missed in a first encounter because most players would just shoot immediately. But DEADBOLT allows 2 different entrances to this level, and no matter which entrance you choose, you'll end up alerting the Hound in the opposing room. So in both scenarios the player learns that Hounds can't open doors. We could keep going, but I think you get the gist. And wouldn't you agree that these micro-tutorials are just so satisfying to think about? If you only look at level design in terms of environment art, it can all seem so intangible and directionless. But DEADBOLT's many incredibly deliberate layouts are a fascinating counterexample. DEADBOLT's third act starts with a very odd level called Overnight Shipping. I say it's odd because it seems almost empty from a game design standpoint. As we previously laid out, DEADBOLT's gameplay is all about crafting your tactics within a level. But Overnight Shipping is too linear to facilitate this. All planning becomes trivial as you go from point A to point B and back. And yet the level has a clear purpose. It's all about the vibe. It's not uncommon for games to celebrate a boss battle with an easier level, but Overnight Shipping seems to exist entirely for the power fantasy. Towards the end of the level, there's this memorable section where you climb up the ladder of a crane and scope out enemies with a long-range rifle. Cool. But for our purposes, there's an anatomy to this sense of cool. For example, it sticks out as one of the few vertical moments of the game, and verticality has a certain feel to it. Being above someone feels authoritative, especially as most games also bring some gameplay advantage. And in DEADBOLT, the contrast becomes particularly stark as enemies can't shoot upwards, so the sensation is that of a predator. I want to make a broader point here about the aesthetics of level design. If we want to understand the atmosphere of a level, how it feels to inhabit a certain game space, it's about much more than the lighting and color palette and environment art. Those are all important, of course, but there's something else going on here. This moment would be interesting even if the level was reduced to abstract hitboxes. What we're dealing with here is an asymmetric relationship of spaces. Space A is dangerous and vulnerable, it's teeming with enemies, whereas Space B is commanding and untouchable. Space B acts on Space A, but Space A can't act on Space B. It's interesting before graphics or context. I'm going to borrow some terminology from Christopher Totten's architectural approach to level design. Space A is called a prospect space, and Space B is called a refuge space. The defining characteristic of prospect spaces is that they're dangerous, and the defining characteristic of refuge spaces is that they're safe. The ideal prospect is large, well-lit, unpredictable, and makes the player vulnerable, whereas the ideal refuge is small, dark, entirely manageable, and provides various gameplay advantages. Typical prospects are open landscapes and arenas, whereas typical refuges are nooks and checkpoints. Most spaces, however, lie somewhere in between, so it's useful to think of it as a spectrum. I think this is key to understanding why DEADBOLT's levels feel so dynamic. Every level is a complex interplay of prospect and refuge that drives the tension. You hop around between refuge spaces, luring enemies from prospect to refuge, slowly chipping away at the prospects as more and more of the level belongs to you. It has that same rhythm we associate with good pacing. Refuge, prospect, refuge, prospect. Here's a clip from the level Val, where a sniper is constantly following your movements. My hasty rush into prospect territory ends in this awkward scramble as I alert half the level. I'm barely able to carve out another refuge for myself, but this time the process is completely different. I can attack the next prospect in a much more controlled manner. Notice how much affect hides in this level design. The deliberation as you consider which refuge to attack from, the tension as you enter into a prospect space, and the chaos of scrambling back to a refuge. There is a palpable vitality to interacting with these spaces. A skeptical viewer might object that this can't be all that special, surely other games also work like this. But we can dismiss this with a quick glance across the medium. Let's take Cyberpunk as the punching bag again. It's a fairly inoffensive game, most of its systems have been standardized for years now, so I think it's emblematic of broader patterns in game design. And yet, we can take almost any clip from the game's combat, pause whenever we like, and ask ourselves, which direction should the player take? Number 1, 2, or 3? The correct answer is that it doesn't matter. The difference will be marginal. In lieu of DEADBOLT's clear relationships of spaces, what we have here is ambivalent flatness, and so the feel of it ends up being just that, ambivalent. Of course, Cyberpunk's stealth sections fare better. Stealth mechanics in most games demand a deeper engagement with space. But even here, we find a whole lot of one-note level design and banal encounters. Your options for interacting with the space are too shallow to achieve the tactics and tension we find in DEADBOLT. Once again, I have to emphasize that my goal is not to badmouth Cyberpunk. I just think this is a contrast we can learn from. The game has some absolutely stunning environments, and here's an indie game consisting of, bluntly speaking, sparsely furnished rectangles, and yet it's the rectangles that exemplify aesthetic richness in their structure. This is the thought I want to conclude on. Level design is not just about crafting memorable environments, no, it's about shaping game space. The industry is keen on forgetting the medium. So many of our top-selling games are spectacular works in every regard except as games. And this seems to happen with level design most of all. There are countless video game spaces which seem wonderful to dwell in or to take a walk in, but how few of them are actually interesting for gameplay. And this is why, 10 years after first playing it, I find myself thinking about DEADBOLT and its rectangles. The level design here is never perfect and always extremely valuable.